The bitter December wind whistled through the cracks of the cabin as Wyatt Young stared out at his snow-covered ranch, the weight of solitude pressing down on his broad shoulders like the blanket of white covering his Montana homestead. The winter of 1887 had come early and with unforgiving force, transforming his hard-won cattle operation into a fragile enterprise that hung by a thread as thin as the smoke rising from his chimney. He'd spent 5 years building this place from nothing, and now, as the blizzard continued its relentless assault, he wondered if it had all been for nothing. The knock at his door came so suddenly that Wyatt nearly dropped the coffee cup clutched between his calloused hands. Visitors were rare in these parts, especially during a snowstorm that had been raging for 3 days straight. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver on his hip, a habit formed from years on the frontier where trust came at a premium. "Who's there?" he called, his deep voice carrying over the howl of the wind. "Please," came a woman's voice, barely audible. "I need help." Wyatt unbolted the door and pulled it open, immediately hit by a blast of frigid air and swirling snow. There, huddled against the storm, stood a woman wrapped in a snow-covered cloak, her face nearly blue with cold. "Good Lord," Wyatt breathed, reaching out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. "Come in, quickly." She stumbled over the threshold, bringing with her the scent of frost and desperation. As Wyatt closed the door against the storm, she pushed back her hood, revealing auburn hair and eyes the color of summer sage. "Thank you," she whispered, her teeth chattering violently. "My wagon." "The wheel broke about a mile back. I tried to walk, find shelter." "You're lucky you found anything in this whiteout," Wyatt said, guiding her toward the fire. "I'm Wyatt Young. This is my ranch." "Charlotte Hayes," she replied, extending trembling fingers toward the flames. "I was headed to Helena to meet my uncle." As the fire's glow illuminated her face, Wyatt saw strength beneath her exhaustion, a determination that seemed at odds with her delicate features. Something about the way she held herself, even while shivering violently, suggested she was accustomed to facing challenges head-on. "You'll not make it to Helena tonight, Miss Hayes," Wyatt said, pulling a wool blanket from a nearby chair and draping it around her shoulders. "Or tomorrow, for that matter. This storm's likely to last another day at least." Charlotte nodded, her gaze drifting to the window where snow continued to accumulate against the glass. "I feared as much when I saw those clouds rolling in. I should have found shelter sooner." "What brings you out to these parts alone?" Wyatt asked, moving to the stove to pour her a cup of coffee. "My parents died last spring," she said simply, accepting the steaming cup with grateful hands. "Influenza. Uncle Thomas is my only family now. He owns a general store in Helena." Wyatt nodded, understanding loss all too well. "I'm sorry to hear that." They fell into silence as Charlotte sipped her coffee, color gradually returning to her cheeks. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows with renewed fury. Wyatt moved to stoke the fire, adding another log to the flames. "You live here alone, Mr. Young?" Charlotte asked, watching him work. "Just Wyatt, please. And yes, it's just me and about 60 head of cattle, though they're huddled in the barn tonight." He managed a small smile. "And an ornery old horse named Buck who thinks he runs the place." Charlotte laughed softly, the sound warming the room more than the fire could. "Sounds like you have your hands full. It keeps me busy." Wyatt glanced out the window at the thickening snow. "Once this storm passes, I'll help you retrieve your wagon and see about fixing that wheel. Until then, you're welcome to stay here." "I don't wish to impose," Charlotte began, but Wyatt shook his head. "No imposition, not in weather like this. Out here, we look after each other. It's the only way to survive." He paused, then added, "I have a small room off the kitchen you can use. It's not much, but it's warm." Charlotte studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether to trust this stranger who'd opened his door to her. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Wyatt. Your kindness won't be forgotten." As night fell and the storm raged on, Wyatt found himself oddly comforted by the presence of another person in his cabin. For too long, his only companions had been the mountains, his livestock, and his own thoughts. Having someone to share a meal with, even a simple one of beans, cornbread, and coffee, reminded him of what he'd been missing these past years. Charlotte, for her part, proved to be more than just a stranded traveler. She insisted on helping prepare dinner, moving around his kitchen with unexpected efficiency. As they ate, she shared stories of her life in St. Louis, where she'd taught at a small school before her parents' passing. "Teaching suited me," she said, a wistful smile playing at her lips. "There's something wonderful about watching a child grasp a new concept, seeing that moment of understanding dawn in their eyes." "Sounds rewarding," Wyatt replied. "Different from ranching. Out here, the lessons usually involve mud, blood, or both, and the students, be they horses or cattle, aren't particularly grateful for the education." Charlotte laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I imagine not, though I suspect there's satisfaction in it all the same. Building something from nothing." "There is," Wyatt admitted, surprised by her insight. "When I first came here, this was just unclaimed land with potential. Now it's a working ranch. Not the biggest or the best, but it's mine." "That's something to be proud of," Charlotte said, her eyes meeting his across the table. Later, as Wyatt prepared the small room for his unexpected guest, he couldn't help but wonder at the strange twist of fate that had brought Charlotte Hayes to his door. It had been nearly 2 years since he'd had a proper conversation with anyone besides the occasional cattle buyer or supply merchant. He'd forgotten how it felt to share space with another person, to hear laughter within these walls. "I hope this will be comfortable enough," he said, setting a lantern on the small table beside the narrow bed. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold." "It's perfect," Charlotte assured him, taking in the modest accommodations with genuine appreciation. "Certainly better than freezing to death in a snowdrift." "A ringing endorsement," Wyatt replied dryly, though he couldn't help but smile at her practical outlook. "Good night, Wyatt," she said softly, "and thank you again." "Good night, Charlotte," he responded, pulling the door closed behind him. As he settled into his own bed that night, listening to the wind's mournful keening around the eaves, Wyatt found himself thinking of the woman sleeping just rooms away. There was something about her, a quiet resilience, an understated strength that resonated with him. In a land where survival demanded grit and determination, Charlotte Hayes seemed well equipped, despite her city upbringing. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, snow piling ever higher against the cabin walls. By morning, drifts had nearly reached the windowsills, transforming the landscape into an unrecognizable expanse of white. Wyatt rose before dawn, as was his habit, and made his way through the snow to check on the livestock in the barn. The cold bit at his face as he trudged through knee-deep snow, his breath creating plumes of vapor in the frigid air. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots at the door, he found Charlotte already awake and tending to the fire, her hair neatly braided down her back. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the coffee pot she'd placed on the stove. "I thought you might appreciate something warm after being out in that cold." "Mind? I'd say you've earned your keep already," Wyatt said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "The animals are fine, but we're properly snowed in now. Drifts are higher than I've seen in years." Charlotte nodded, her expression thoughtful as she looked out at the white expanse. "It's beautiful in a dangerous sort of way." Wyatt followed her gaze. The morning sun had broken through, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. His ranch, usually a collection of functional buildings and fenced pastures, had been transformed into something almost magical, each structure outlined in pristine white against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains. "I suppose it is," he agreed, seeing his home through new eyes. "Though I'd appreciate it more if I didn't have to dig my way to the barn twice a day." Charlotte smiled, passing him a steaming cup of coffee. "The things we endure for beauty." They spent that day in domestic accord, with Wyatt venturing out periodically to tend the animals while Charlotte kept the home fires burning. Between trips to the barn, Wyatt showed Charlotte his modest library books being his one indulgence in an otherwise practical life. "Whitman," she said with evident pleasure, running her fingers along the spine of leaves of grass. "You surprise me, Mr. Young." "Is it so surprising that a rancher might enjoy poetry?" he asked, one eyebrow raised in challenge. "Perhaps not," she conceded. "But it adds an unexpected dimension to the rugged cowboy image." "I contain multitudes," Wyatt quoted with a small smile, and was rewarded with a look of delighted recognition from Charlotte. By evening, the snowfall had finally ceased, though the temperature continued to drop. After dinner, a stew Charlotte had prepared from Wyatt's meager pantry supplies, somehow making dried beans and preserved vegetables taste like something special. They sat before the fire, the comfortable silence of newfound companionship settling between them. "Tell me about your ranch," Charlotte said eventually, her voice soft in the flickering light. "How did you come to be here?" Wyatt stared into the flames, considering his answer. "I came west after the war, saw too much back east, lost too many friends, needed something different." "You fought in the war between the states?" Charlotte asked, surprise evident in her voice. "Union Army. I was young, just 17 when I enlisted in '64. Wyatt rarely spoke of this part of his life, but something about Charlotte made the words come easier. "Spent a year fighting before it ended." "A year too long," Charlotte nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My father fought as well. He rarely spoke of it, but I know it haunted him." "Some things are better left in the past," Wyatt said, his voice roughening. "Anyway, after I drifted west. Worked cattle drives in Texas, punched cows in Wyoming, saved every dollar I could until I had enough to claim this land 5 years ago. And now you've built all this," Charlotte said, gesturing around them. "On your own." "Mostly. Had help with the barn raising from neighboring ranchers. Out here, folks come together for the big jobs even if we're miles apart most days." "It must get lonely," Charlotte observed, her eyes studying his face. Wyatt shrugged, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I keep busy. There's always work to be done." "Yes, but work isn't company," Charlotte persisted gently. "No," Wyatt admitted after a long moment. "It isn't." The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, and a faint cracking sound indicated the logs of the cabin contracting in the cold. "It's going to be bitter tonight," Wyatt said, changing the subject. "Best keep the fire built up." Charlotte nodded, but her eyes held questions he wasn't ready to answer. Questions about why a man would choose this solitary existence, why he'd push away the comfort of human connection in favor of silent mountains and endless work. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Wyatt awoke to a world transformed by moonlight reflecting off snow, casting an ethereal glow through his window. The thermometer outside his bedroom window showed 15 degrees below zero, dangerously cold, especially for someone unaccustomed to Montana winters. He found Charlotte already awake, wrapped in a quilt as she gazed out the front window at the snow-covered expanse of his ranch. "It's like looking at a different world," she said without turning, somehow sensing his presence. everything familiar made strange by snow. Wyatt moved to stand beside her, taking in the transformed landscape. In the early morning light, his modest ranch looked almost grand, the simple buildings dignified by their coating of snow, the distant mountains rising majestically against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. "It's a hard place," he said quietly, "beautiful but unforgiving." "Like most things worth having," Charlotte replied, finally turning to look at him. In the clear morning light, her eyes were greener than he'd first thought, flecked with gold near the centers. Wyatt cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I need to check the cattle. In this cold, the water troughs will have frozen over. After breakfast, I'll head out to look for your wagon. With luck, we can dig it out and bring it back here for repairs." Charlotte nodded, but her gaze lingered on his face a moment longer. "I'll have breakfast ready when you return." The brutal cold made the morning chores take twice as long as usual. Wyatt had to break through inches of ice on the water troughs, check each animal for signs of frostbite or distress, and ensure the barn was as insulated as possible against the killing cold. By the time he returned to the cabin, his fingers were numb despite his heavy gloves, and his face felt frozen solid. True to her word, Charlotte had breakfast waiting, flapjacks and coffee, simple fare, but exactly what he needed after hours in the bitter cold. "You're half frozen," she observed as he sat heavily at the table, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the coffee. "Occupational hazard," Wyatt replied, cradling the hot mug between his palms. "The animals come first, especially in weather like this." Charlotte sat across from him, her own coffee steaming before her. "What made you choose this life? There must have been easier paths for a man with your obvious intelligence." Wyatt considered the question as he took a long drink of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. "After the war, I couldn't stomach crowds or noise, needed space and quiet to put myself back together, I suppose. And have you put yourself back together?" Charlotte's question was gentle but direct. "Mostly," Wyatt answered truthfully. "Some parts may never fit quite right again, but I've made peace with that." Charlotte nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My father was the same way after he came home. Different somehow. It took years before he could stand to be in crowded places again." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the occasional pop from the fire. "After breakfast, I'll saddle Buck and we'll go find your wagon," Wyatt said finally. "The snow's deep, but we should be able to follow your tracks before they're completely covered." "Is it safe to go out?" Charlotte asked, concern evident in her voice. "Safe enough for a short trip. The weather's clear and we won't go far." "Your wagon can't be more than a mile or so east, based on where you said you had trouble." Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you. I don't want to be a burden any longer than necessary." "You're not a burden," Wyatt said, more forcefully than he'd intended. Softening his tone, he added, "It's nice having someone to talk to, truth be told." A smile touched Charlotte's lips. "Well then, I'm glad my misfortune could provide you with some company." After breakfast, they bundled up against the cold Charlotte in a spare coat of Wyatt's that dwarfed her slender frame, wrapped over her own clothing for extra protection against the frigid air. Wyatt saddled Buck, an aging buckskin gelding who regarded the proceedings with a baleful eye, clearly unimpressed with being called to duty in such weather. "He looks spirited," Charlotte observed diplomatically as the horse pinned his ears back at Wyatt's approach. "Buck and I have an understanding," Wyatt replied, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease. "He pretends to hate me and I pretend to believe him." He reached down a hand to Charlotte. "Can you ride?" "I grew up riding," she assured him, placing her gloved hand in his and allowing him to pull her up behind him. The sensation of her arms wrapping around his waist was both foreign and oddly comfortable. It had been years since Wyatt had been this close to another person, and the simple human contact sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the heavy coat he wore. They set off through the deep snow, Buck snorting his disapproval with every step. The brilliant sunshine made the snow-covered landscape almost blindingly bright, and their breath formed clouds of vapor that hung in the still, cold air. Following the barely visible depression in the snow that marked Charlotte's desperate journey to his cabin, they headed east toward the main road, little more than a wagon track that connected Wyatt's isolated ranch to the nearest town, some 15 miles away. "There," Charlotte said after they'd ridden about a mile, pointing to a dark shape half buried in snow near a stand of pines. "That's my wagon." They approached to find a small wagon with a broken wheel, listing to one side like a shipwreck on a sea of white. A single horse, still harnessed but covered with a blanket, stood patiently in the traces, its breath creating plumes of vapor in the cold air. "You left your horse?" Wyatt asked, surprised that this detail hadn't come up in their previous conversations. "I couldn't get him free without tools," Charlotte explained as Wyatt helped her dismount. "And I didn't want to force him to walk through such deep snow. He seemed better off here, sheltered by the pines. I left him water and feed and made sure the blanket was secure." Wyatt approached the animal, a sturdy bay gelding who regarded him with calm eyes. "He looks no worse for wear," he conceded, checking the horse over for any signs of distress or injury. "Smart decision leaving him here. He's in better shape than you were when you reached my door." Charlotte smiled ruefully, patting the bay's neck. "This is Samson. He's been with me for years, steady as they come." Wyatt set to work examining the wagon wheel, kneeling in the snow to better see the damage. "Axle's broken clean through," he observed. "Must have hit a rock or stump hidden by the snow. We can't fix this here, we'll need to bring it back to the ranch." "Can it be repaired?" Charlotte asked, concern evident in her voice. "I have the tools and materials," Wyatt assured her. "It'll take a couple of days of work, but we can make it roadworthy again." He stood, brushing snow from his knees. "For now, let's unhitch Samson and bring him back with us. Tomorrow, when it's a bit warmer, I'll return with my work team and sled to retrieve the wagon." Working together, they managed to free Samson from his harness and secure Charlotte's belongings, a small trunk, and several packages to Buck's saddle. With Charlotte riding Samson and Wyatt on Buck, they made their way back to the ranch as the winter sun began its early descent toward the horizon. The temperature dropped rapidly as dusk approached, and by the time they reached the cabin, twilight was spreading across the snow-covered landscape, painting it in shades of blue and purple. After settling the horses in the barn with fresh hay and water, they hurried into the warmth of the cabin, their faces stinging from the cold. "I think my eyelashes froze," Charlotte said, laughing as she unwound the scarf from around her face. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her eyes bright, and Wyatt found himself staring longer than was polite. "Let me build up the fire," he said, turning away to hide his discomfort. "It'll be another cold night." As darkness fell outside, the cabin became a warm haven against the bitter cold. Charlotte busied herself preparing dinner from Wyatt's modest supplies, while he tended to final evening chores around the ranch. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots at the door, the cabin was filled with the aroma of cooking food and the soft glow of lamplight. "Something smells good," he commented, hanging his coat beside the door. "Just beans and bacon with cornbread," Charlotte replied from her position at the stove. "Nothing fancy, but it should warm us up." "Fancy isn't necessary," Wyatt said, moving to wash his hands in the basin by the sink. Hot and filling does just fine. They ate at the small table near the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up again, its mournful howl a reminder of the harsh realities that lay beyond their temporary sanctuary. "Will you be able to retrieve the wagon tomorrow?" Charlotte asked, breaking a comfortable silence. "Weather permitting," Wyatt replied, glancing toward the window where frost had formed intricate patterns on the glass. "If not tomorrow, then the next day. There's no rush." Charlotte's gaze dropped to her plate. "I don't want to overstay my welcome." "You're not," Wyatt said simply. "Having you here, it's nice." The words felt inadequate to express what he meant, how her presence had somehow made his cabin feel more like a home than it had in all the years he'd lived there alone. How the sound of another voice, another person moving through the rooms, had filled a void he hadn't fully recognized until now. Charlotte looked up, her eyes meeting his across the table. "Even so, I should reach my uncle soon. He'll be worried when I don't arrive as expected." "The next time I go into town, I can send a telegram," Wyatt offered. "Let him know you're safe and will be delayed by the weather." "That would be kind of you," Charlotte said, her expression softening. "Though I'm not sure when that might be, given the condition of the roads." "Miller's Creek is only 15 miles east," Wyatt explained. "Once the weather breaks and your wagon is repaired, we can make the trip in a day. There's a telegraph office there, as well as supplies we might need for the repairs." Charlotte nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Thank you, Wyatt, for everything." Later, as they sat before the fire, Charlotte mending a tear in her cloak while Wyatt cleaned his revolver, a nightly ritual born of military habit, she asked the question he'd been half expecting since her arrival. "Have you always been alone here?" Wyatt's hand stilled on the weapon. "Yes," he answered, then amended, "mostly. Had a ranch hand for the first year or so, but he moved on to the gold fields up north." Charlotte's needle continued its steady movement through the fabric. "I meant, has there ever been someone special, a wife or—" "No," Wyatt said, the word coming out more sharply than he'd intended. More gently he added, "Never found the right time or the right person, I suppose." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said softly. "I shouldn't pry." "It's not prying," Wyatt assured her, resuming his work on the revolver. "Natural to be curious." After a moment he asked, "What about you?" "No husband waiting in Helena," Charlotte shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "No, I was engaged once before the fever took my parents. After they died, everything changed. Thomas, my fiancé, not my uncle. He wanted me to proceed with the wedding as planned, but it felt wrong, celebrating while in mourning. We quarreled about it and eventually the engagement was broken." "His loss," Wyatt said simply, surprising himself with the sentiment. Charlotte looked up, her eyes meeting his across the room. "Perhaps it was for the best. We wanted different things from life, I think. He saw teaching as a temporary occupation for me, something to pass the time until children came along. But I loved it. The thought of giving it up entirely." "You shouldn't have to give up something you love," Wyatt said, reassembling his revolver with practiced motions. "That's what I thought," Charlotte replied, her needle pausing. "But at the time it seemed like a sacrifice I should be willing to make. Now I'm not so certain." "What will you do in Helena?" Wyatt asked, holstering the cleaned weapon. "My uncle has offered me a position in his store. It's not teaching, but it's honest work, and he's my only family now." Charlotte resumed her stitching. "Perhaps I can find a school there in need of a teacher, once I'm settled." Wyatt nodded, understanding the practical considerations that drove such decisions. In the West, survival often took precedence over personal fulfillment. It was a reality he knew well. As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, Wyatt found himself reluctant to end the evening. Charlotte's company had awakened something in him, a need for human connection that he'd buried beneath years of solitary existence. "I should turn in," Charlotte said finally, setting aside her mending. "It's been a long day." "Of course," Wyatt agreed, rising to his feet. "Sleep well." Charlotte paused at the door to the small room she occupied. "Good night, Wyatt," she said softly, her eyes lingering on his face a moment longer than necessary before she disappeared inside. Wyatt remained by the dying fire, listening to the wind's plaintive cry around the eaves. For the first time in years, his cabin felt too quiet when he finally retired to his own bed. The next day dawned clear but bitterly cold. Wyatt rose before first light, as was his habit, and ventured out to tend to the livestock. The thermometer outside his window read 20 below zero, dangerously cold, especially for someone unaccustomed to Montana winters. After breaking ice on water troughs and ensuring all the animals were fed, and as comfortable as possible, he returned to the cabin to find Charlotte already awake and tending to the fire. "It's brutal out there," he said, hanging his frost-covered coat by the door. "Too cold to attempt retrieving your wagon today. The work would be too hard on the horses." Charlotte nodded, unsurprised. "I thought as much when I saw the frost patterns on the windows. They've nearly covered the entire pane." "We'll wait for it to warm a bit," Wyatt said, moving to the stove where coffee was already brewing. "Another day or two, the temperature should rise enough to make the journey safer." "I'm in no hurry," Charlotte replied, her voice gentle. "This is a comfortable place to be stranded." Wyatt felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee he poured into a mug. "Glad to hear it." They spent the day in domestic accord, with Wyatt venturing out periodically to check on the animals while Charlotte kept busy inside. Between trips to the barn, Wyatt showed Charlotte more of the ranch, at least the parts that could be viewed from windows, or the relative shelter of the porch. He pointed out the distant line of trees that marked the creek running through his property, the rolling hills where his cattle grazed in warmer months, and the mountains that formed a majestic backdrop to it all. "It's beautiful," Charlotte said, her breath fogging the window glass as she looked out at the snow-covered expanse. "I can see why you chose this place. In spring, it's even better," Wyatt told her, standing close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. "The creek runs full with snowmelt, and the hills turn so green it almost hurts your eyes to look at them. Wildflowers everywhere." "I'd like to see that," Charlotte said softly, then seemed to catch herself. "Though I suppose I'll be long gone by then." Wyatt felt an unexpected pang at the reminder that Charlotte's stay was temporary, a brief interlude forced by circumstance rather than choice. "Yes, I suppose you will be," he agreed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, the temperature outside continued to plummet. The logs of the cabin creaked and popped as they contracted in the cold, and despite the fire's warmth, a chill seemed to seep through the walls. "Would you read something?" Charlotte asked suddenly, gesturing to Wyatt's small collection of books. "It's been so long since I've heard poetry read aloud." Wyatt hesitated, unused to performing for an audience, but found himself unable to refuse her request. He selected Whitman's Leaves of Grass from the shelf and settled back into his chair, opening to a dog-eared page. "When I heard The Learned Astronomer," he began, his deep voice filling the small room. "When the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me." As he read, Wyatt found himself relaxing into the rhythm of the words, his initial self-consciousness fading. Charlotte watched him with rapt attention, her expression soft in the firelight. When he finished the poem, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. "You read beautifully," Charlotte said finally. "Your voice suits Whitman's words." Wyatt felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married. She believed in the power of words, made sure I appreciated them too." "She taught you well," Charlotte observed. "Are your parents still living?" Wyatt shook his head. "No, lost my father to pneumonia when I was 14. Mother followed 2 years later, heart trouble, the doctor said, though I think grief played its part." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "It's hard being the one left behind." "It is," Wyatt agreed, closing the book and setting it aside. "Though it gets easier to bear with time." Charlotte nodded, her gaze drifting to the fire. "Yes, the sharp edges of grief seem to soften eventually, though they never disappear entirely." Another comfortable silence fell between them, each lost in private memories. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch succumbing to the weight of ice and snow. "It's getting late," Charlotte said finally, rising from her chair. "I should turn in." Wyatt nodded, standing as well. "Sleep well." Charlotte paused at the door to her room, turning back to face him. "Thank you for reading to me, Wyatt. It was special." Before he could respond, she had disappeared into the small room, leaving him standing alone by the dying fire, the memory of her smile warming him more effectively than the flames. The following days fell into a pattern as they waited for the temperature to rise enough to make retrieving Charlotte's wagon feasible. Wyatt attended to his ranch duties while Charlotte kept the cabin in order, cooking meals and mending clothing with a deft hand. In the evenings, they talked sometimes of practical matters, but increasingly of deeper things: hopes, dreams, disappointments, and small triumphs. Wyatt found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, tales of his time on cattle drives, his early struggles to establish the ranch, the satisfaction of building something lasting with his own 2 hands. Charlotte, in turn, spoke of her teaching days, her parents, and her hopes for a new beginning in Helena. On the 4th night of Charlotte's stay, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Wyatt found himself studying her profile in the flickering light. The curve of her cheek, the way loose tendrils of hair escaped her practical braid, the thoughtful set of her mouth as she gazed into the flames, these details had become unexpectedly precious to him. "Penny for your thoughts," Charlotte said suddenly, turning to catch him watching her. Wyatt looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Just wondering about the weather. It seems to be warming some." Charlotte's expression suggested she didn't quite believe this explanation, but she nodded. "Yes, I noticed the icicles beginning to drip from the eaves today." "A good sign, I suppose. If it continues warming tomorrow, we might attempt to retrieve your wagon," Wyatt said, though the words came reluctantly. Each day that passed made the thought of Charlotte's eventual departure more difficult to contemplate. "That would be good," Charlotte replied, though Wyatt thought he detected a similar reluctance in her voice. The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the corners of the cabin with a mournful sound. "Another storm coming," Wyatt observed, glancing toward the window where frost had formed intricate patterns on the glass. "Will it be as bad as the last one?" Charlotte asked, concern evident in her voice. Wyatt shook his head. "Hard to say. The clouds were building to the north when I checked the cattle this afternoon. Could blow over, could settle in." Charlotte sighed, setting aside the book she'd been reading. "I feel as though I've become an imposition. You've been so kind, and here I am, still taking up space in your home." "You're not an imposition," Wyatt said firmly. "Having you here has been pleasant." The word felt inadequate, but he couldn't bring himself to say what he truly felt, that her presence had transformed his solitary existence, making him realize how empty his life had become. How the sound of her laughter had somehow made his cabin feel like a home for the first time since he'd built it. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "Even so, I can't stay forever. My uncle will be wondering what's become of me." "No," Wyatt agreed, his voice roughening. "You can't stay forever." The words hung between them, laden with unspoken sentiment. Charlotte's gaze dropped to her hands, folded neatly in her lap. "It's getting late. I should turn in." Wyatt nodded, rising as she did. "Sleep well, Charlotte." She paused at the door to the small room she'd been occupying, looking back at him with an expression that made his heart beat faster. "Good night, Wyatt," she said softly. And then she was gone, the door closing quietly behind her. Wyatt remained by the fire, listening to the wind's increasing fury outside. Another storm was indeed coming. He could feel it in the air, in the way the temperature had begun to rise slightly ahead of the approaching front. Tomorrow would likely bring more snow, further delaying Charlotte's departure. The thought brought a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that she would remain a while longer, guilt at finding pleasure in the circumstances that kept her from her destination. And beneath it all, a growing awareness that his feelings for Charlotte Hayes had moved beyond simple hospitality or even friendship. Morning brought the storm. Wyatt had predicted not the blizzard conditions of the previous week, but a steady snowfall that reduced visibility to a few yards beyond the cabin. Any thought of retrieving Charlotte's wagon was postponed indefinitely, as venturing out in such conditions would be foolhardy at best, dangerous at worst. "Looks like you're stuck with me a while longer," Charlotte observed as they stood at the window after breakfast, watching the snow accumulate. "Seems that way," Wyatt agreed, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from his voice. Charlotte glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Try to contain your disappointment." Wyatt felt heat rise to his face at being so transparent. "I didn't mean, I know," Charlotte interrupted gently. "I was teasing you, Wyatt." The sound of his name on her lips sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "I need to check the livestock," he said abruptly, turning away to hide his discomfort. Outside, the snow fell in thick, wet flakes, adding to the already substantial accumulation from previous days. Wyatt made his way to the barn, his mind preoccupied with thoughts of Charlotte. In less than a week, she had somehow become essential to his daily existence. Her smile at breakfast, the sound of her voice as they talked into the evening, the quiet companionship they'd developed. The thought of returning to his solitary life after she left was increasingly difficult to contemplate. The animals were in good condition, despite the continuing bad weather, a testament to the sturdy construction of the barn and Wyatt's diligent care. He took longer than necessary with his chores, using the physical labor to clear his head and settle his thoughts. By the time he returned to the cabin, the snow had begun to taper off, though gray clouds still hung low over the mountains. He found Charlotte seated by the fire, one of his books open on her lap. "The livestock are fine," Wyatt reported, hanging his snow-covered coat near the door. "Storm's easing up a bit." Charlotte nodded, closing the book as he approached. "That's good news. Though I suspect the roads will remain impassable for a while yet." "Likely so," Wyatt agreed, moving to stand before the fire, his back to the flames as he faced her. "Even when the snow stops, it will take time for the drifts to settle enough for safe travel." Charlotte studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly to one side. "You seem troubled, Wyatt. Is something wrong?" The direct question caught him off guard. "No," he said quickly, then amended. "Not wrong exactly, just thinking." "About?" Charlotte prompted when he didn't elaborate. Wyatt hesitated, unused to expressing his feelings so directly. about how different things have been since you arrived, how quickly I've grown accustomed to having you here." Charlotte's expression softened. "I've enjoyed being here as well, despite the circumstances." "Have you?" Wyatt asked, a note of vulnerability creeping into his voice. "Very much," Charlotte assured him, setting the book aside and rising to stand before him. "These days with you have been unexpected but precious." They stood facing each other, close enough that Wyatt could see the flecks of gold in Charlotte's green eyes, the small scar near her right eyebrow, the way her lips parted slightly as she gazed up at him. "Charlotte," he began, unsure of what he wanted to say but feeling the need to say something. Before he could continue, the sound of cracking would split the air, followed immediately by a tremendous crash from the direction of the barn. Wyatt whirled toward the window, his heart racing. "What was that?" Charlotte asked, alarm evident in her voice. "Sounds like part of the barn roof may have collapsed under the weight of the snow," Wyatt said grimly, already moving toward his coat. "I need to check on the animals." "I'm coming with you," Charlotte said firmly, reaching for her own coat. "It's too dangerous," Wyatt protested. "If more of the structure gives way, all the more reason you shouldn't go alone," Charlotte interrupted, her expression brooking no argument. "Two sets of hands will be better than one if the animals need to be moved quickly." Wyatt recognized the determination in her eyes and nodded reluctantly. "Stay close to me, and if I tell you to get out, you do it immediately. No questions." "Agreed," Charlotte said, buttoning her coat. They hurried through the snow toward the barn, where it was immediately apparent that a section of the roof had indeed collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow. A jagged hole gaped in what had been the eastern corner of the structure. Snow and splintered timber scattered across the ground below. Inside, the animals were agitated but unharmed, the collapsed section having been over an empty stall. Wyatt moved quickly to assess the damage, his experienced eye taking in the compromised support beams and the precarious state of the remaining roof. "We need to move the horses to the western end of the barn," he told Charlotte, already leading Buck from his stall. "This whole section could go at any time." Together, they relocated the horses Buck, Samson, and Wyatt's two draft horses to the sturdier part of the barn. Wyatt then turned his attention to the damaged structure, climbing cautiously up to examine the broken beams more closely. "The weight of the snow weakened the joists," he called down to Charlotte, who stood watching anxiously from below. "I need to shore this up temporarily until the storm passes and I can effect proper repairs." "What can I do to help?" Charlotte asked, practical in the face of crisis. "There are support timbers stored along the back wall," Wyatt directed. "If you could bring them, I can start bracing the weakened sections." Charlotte nodded and moved to fetch the indicated supplies. For the next hour, they worked together to stabilize the damaged roof, Wyatt positioning support beams, while Charlotte handed up tools and additional materials as needed. Despite the cold and the physical demands of the task, she worked without complaint, her practical nature and quick intelligence making her an invaluable assistant. By the time they had done all they could to secure the structure, both were exhausted and chilled to the bone. The temporary repairs would hold until better weather allowed for more permanent solutions, but the close call had been a stark reminder of the dangers posed by a Montana winter. "You're shivering," Wyatt observed as they made their way back to the cabin through the still falling snow. "Just cold," Charlotte assured him, though her teeth were chattering audibly. "Nothing a fire and hot coffee won't fix." Once inside, Wyatt built up the fire while Charlotte put water on to boil. They moved with the easy coordination of people accustomed to working together, despite the brevity of their acquaintance. "You handled yourself well out there," Wyatt commented as they sat before the fire a short time later, mugs of hot coffee warming their hands. Not many city women would have kept their heads so well in that situation. Charlotte smiled, though fatigue was evident in the lines of her face. I may have grown up in St. Louis, but my father believed in practical education. He taught me never to panic in a crisis, that clear thinking is always more useful than hysteria. Wise man, Wyatt said appreciatively. He was, Charlotte agreed, her expression softening with remembrance. I miss him. Both my parents really, but especially his steady presence. He always seemed to know what to do, no matter the situation. Wyatt nodded, understanding the particular ache of missing a father's guidance. My father was similar. Practical to his core, but kind with it. Taught me everything I know about animal husbandry and carpentry. He'd be proud of what you've built here, Charlotte said softly. I hope so, Wyatt replied, touched by her understanding. It's not much compared to some of the bigger operations, but it's mine, built with my own hands. That makes it all the more valuable, Charlotte said, her eyes meeting his across the space between them. They fell into comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. The physical exertion and emotional strain of the day had left them both drained. Yet Wyatt felt a curious contentment in Charlotte's company, as though the shared crisis had somehow cemented the bond forming between them. We should get some rest, Charlotte said finally, setting aside her empty mug. It's been a long day. Wyatt nodded, rising to his feet. Tomorrow I'll need to make more permanent repairs to the barn, weather permitting. I'll help, Charlotte offered immediately. You don't have to. I want to, she interrupted gently. We make a good team, don't we? The simple question carried more weight than its words suggested. Wyatt looked at her, this woman who had come into his life by chance, who had somehow fit herself into his solitary existence as though she'd always belonged there. Yes, he agreed softly. We do. Charlotte held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then she turned toward her room, pausing at the door. Good night, Wyatt. Sleep well. Good night, Charlotte, he replied, watching as she disappeared inside, the door closing quietly behind her. Alone by the dying fire, Wyatt contemplated the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he'd been content in his solitude, convinced that the quiet routine of ranch life was all he needed or wanted. Now, the thought of returning to that existence after Charlotte left seemed unbearable. Yet what could he offer her? His ranch was modest at best, his life hard and often lonely. Charlotte deserved more than a struggling rancher in an isolated corner of Montana. She deserved the life she'd planned, security with her uncle in Helena, perhaps a teaching position where her intelligence and kind heart could benefit others. With these troubled thoughts, Wyatt banked the fire for the night and retired to his own room, though sleep proved elusive as his mind continued to wrestle with questions that had no easy answers. The following day brought clear skies and slightly warmer temperatures, though the snow remained deep across the ranch. After breakfast, Wyatt and Charlotte returned to the barn to assess the damage in daylight and begin more substantial repairs. Working side by side throughout the morning, they managed to reinforce the damaged section of roof with additional support beams and patch the hole temporarily with canvas and spare lumber. Charlotte proved as capable in daylight as she had been during the emergency, following Wyatt's instructions with quick intelligence and displaying a willingness to tackle even the most physically demanding tasks. You continue to surprise me, Miss Hayes, Wyatt commented as they paused to rest, sitting on bales of hay with cups of hot coffee Charlotte had thought to bring from the cabin in a thermos. How so? She asked, pushing a stray lock of hair back from her flushed face. Not many women would throw themselves so readily into barn repairs, Wyatt explained. Most would consider it men's work. Charlotte smiled, a spark of amusement in her eyes. I've never had much patience for artificial distinctions between what men and women should do. Work is work, and hands are hands. A practical philosophy, Wyatt observed, admiration evident in his voice. Necessity is often the mother of practicality, Charlotte replied. After my parents died, there was no one else to handle the tasks my father had traditionally done. I learned quickly that waiting for a man to appear and fix things was far less efficient than simply learning to fix them myself. Wyatt nodded, understanding in his eyes. Self-reliance is a quality I've always valued. As have I, Charlotte agreed. Though I've learned it doesn't preclude accepting help when it's offered. There's a difference between independence and isolation. The observation struck Wyatt as uncomfortably perceptive, hitting close to the fortress of solitude he'd built around himself over the years. Before he could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. "Are you expecting visitors?" Charlotte asked, setting aside her coffee cup and rising to her feet. "No," Wyatt replied, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip, a habit formed from years on the frontier, where unexpected visitors could spell trouble. Moving to the barn door, they looked out to see two riders approaching through the snow. Following the path Wyatt had cleared between the cabin and barn. As they drew closer, Wyatt recognized Frank Miller, his nearest neighbor whose ranch lay some 5 miles to the south, and Miller's 16-year-old son, James. "Frank," Wyatt called in greeting as the men drew their horses to a halt before the barn. "This is unexpected." "Wyatt," Frank returned, dismounting with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle. He was a barrel-chested man in his 50s, his weathered face nearly hidden behind a full beard frosted with ice. "Thought we'd check on you after that last storm. Saw the damage to your barn from the ridge. We've got it under control," Wyatt assured him, stepping forward to shake the older man's hand. "Frank Miller, this is Miss Charlotte Hayes. She was caught in the first storm while traveling to Helena and has been waiting out the weather here." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly at the introduction, his gaze moving from Wyatt to Charlotte with undisguised curiosity. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "that first storm was a bad one. Lucky you found shelter when you did." "Indeed, Mr. Miller," Charlotte replied with a polite smile. "Mr. Young has been most accommodating." "I'll bet he has," Frank muttered, just loud enough for Wyatt to hear. Louder, he added, "James and I were heading into Miller's Creek for supplies. Road's passable now if you're needing anything." "Actually, that would be helpful," Wyatt said, ignoring the older man's insinuation. "Miss Hayes's wagon broke down about a mile east of here. The wheel needs repairs before she can continue to Helena." Frank nodded, understanding the situation. "We can stop by the smithy, let him know you'll be needing his services. When do you think you'll be coming into town?" "Tomorrow, if the weather holds," Wyatt replied, glancing at the clear blue sky overhead. "I'll bring the damaged wheel in for repairs." "We'll pass the word along," Frank promised. "Now, how about some coffee before we head out? Been a cold ride." Wyatt invited the Millers into the cabin, where Charlotte quickly prepared fresh coffee and set out the remains of the morning's cornbread. The elder Miller's shrewd eyes took in the domestic scene, Charlotte moving comfortably around Wyatt's kitchen, the 2 cups by the fire, the woman's shawl draped over a chair, but he made no comment beyond general pleasantries. As they prepared to depart an hour later, Frank pulled Wyatt aside on the porch, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to those still inside. "She seems a fine woman." "She is," Wyatt agreed cautiously. Frank studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful beneath his frost-rimmed beard. Been alone out here a long time, Wyatt. Sometimes a man doesn't realize what he's missing until it shows up on his doorstep. It's not like that, Wyatt protested, though the words lacked conviction even to his own ears. She's just passing through. If you say so, Frank replied, clearly unconvinced. But I've seen the way you look at her and the way she looks at you when you're not watching. Might be worth considering whether she has to be just passing through. With that parting observation, Frank rejoined his son, and the two mounted their horses for the journey to Miller's Creek. Wyatt watched them ride away, the older man's words echoing in his mind. When he returned to the cabin, Charlotte was clearing away the coffee cups, her movements efficient and graceful. She looked up as he entered, a small smile curving her lips. "Your neighbor seems nice." "Frank's a good man," Wyatt agreed, moving to help her with the dishes. "Been ranching in these parts for 30 years, knows the land better than anyone." "He said the road to town is passable now," Charlotte observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Wyatt confirmed, suddenly finding it difficult to meet her eyes. "I'll retrieve your wagon tomorrow and take the wheel into Miller's Creek for repairs. Should only take a day or two to fix." Charlotte nodded, her expression unreadable. "That's good news." Was it? Wyatt wasn't sure anymore. The prospect of Charlotte's departure, once an inevitability he'd reluctantly accepted, now filled him with a sense of loss so acute it was almost physical. "Yes," he agreed hollowly. "Good news." They finished the dishes in silence, the easy camaraderie of the morning somehow diminished by the reminder of Charlotte's impending departure. Outside, the sun continued to shine with deceptive brightness on the snow-covered landscape, as though mocking the shadow that had fallen over Wyatt's spirits. That evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, the usual comfortable conversation was replaced by a tension that neither seemed willing to address directly. Wyatt pretended to read, though his eyes scanned the same page repeatedly without absorbing its contents. Charlotte worked on mending a tear in one of her dresses, her needle moving with precise, deliberate strokes. "Wyatt," Charlotte said finally, setting aside her sewing. "Is something troubling you?" He looked up from his book, meeting her concerned gaze across the space between them. "Just thinking about tomorrow, getting your wagon repaired." "Is that all?" Charlotte pressed gently. Wyatt closed his book, marking his place with a finger. "What else would there be?" Charlotte studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "I've enjoyed my time here, unexpected as it was." "I'm glad," Wyatt replied, unsure where the conversation was heading. "Have you?" Charlotte asked directly. "Enjoyed having me here?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Wyatt set his book aside, choosing his words carefully. "More than I expected to. More than I should have, perhaps." "Why do you say that?" Charlotte's voice was soft, encouraging. Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, struggling to articulate feelings he'd scarcely admitted to himself. "Because you'll be leaving soon, returning to your life, your plans, and I'll be alone again," Charlotte finished when he trailed off. "Yes," Wyatt admitted, the single word containing a wealth of emotion. Charlotte rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the small sofa, close enough that he could smell the faint lavender scent that clung to her hair. "It doesn't have to be that way, Wyatt." Wyatt looked at her, hope and doubt warring within him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that plans can change," Charlotte replied, her eyes meeting his steadily. "That sometimes what we think we want isn't what we truly need." "And what do you need, Charlotte?" Wyatt asked, his voice rough with emotion. She reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. "I'm beginning to think it might be this place, this life." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You?" Wyatt stared at her, scarcely daring to believe what he was hearing. "You hardly know me." "I know enough," Charlotte said simply. I know you're kind, honorable, and steady. I know you built this place with your own hands and that you care for it deeply. I know I've felt more at home here in these few days than I have anywhere since my parents died. It's a hard life, Wyatt cautioned, even as hope began to blossom within him. Isolated, rough. Nothing like what you're used to. Perhaps what I'm used to isn't what I want anymore, Charlotte replied. Perhaps I've been looking for something different all along without realizing it. Wyatt's hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. What about your uncle? Your plans for Helena. Uncle Thomas will understand, Charlotte said. He wanted me to come to Helena because he worried about me being alone. If I found happiness elsewhere, he'd be pleased for me. And would you, Wyatt asked, his voice low, find happiness here? Charlotte's gaze held his, unwavering. I believe I could. With you. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then, with a gentleness belying his strength, Wyatt reached up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingertips tracing the delicate line of her jaw. Charlotte, he began, but words failed him. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss, as gentle as the snowflakes that had brought them together, tentative at first, then deepening as Charlotte's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed as he absorbed the reality of what had just happened, what was happening between them. I never expected this, he murmured. Never thought to find someone who would see this place, this life, and choose it willingly. Not just the place or the life, Charlotte corrected softly. You, Wyatt, I'm choosing you. He opened his eyes to find her watching him, her expression a mixture of tenderness and certainty that left him humbled. I don't have much to offer, he said honestly. Just this land, this ranch, myself. That's all I want, Charlotte assured him, her hand still resting over his heart. The rest we can build together. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, not the violent blizzard of days past, but a gentle descent of flakes that glittered in the moonlight. Wyatt drew Charlotte to the window, his arm around her waist as they watched the snow accumulate on the already white landscape. It's beautiful, Charlotte said softly, leaning into his embrace. It is, Wyatt agreed, his gaze on her face rather than the scene outside. Charlotte, I know this is sudden. We've only known each other a short time. If you need more time to think. Some decisions don't require long deliberation, Charlotte interrupted gently. Some are made in an instant when something that was missing suddenly fits into place. Wyatt nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. In the space of a week, this woman had transformed his world, filling empty spaces he hadn't even recognized existed until she came into his life. Then stay, he said simply. Not just until your wagon is repaired. Stay with me. Be my wife. The words emerged without premeditation, yet Wyatt felt no doubt or hesitation as he spoke them. They were right as Charlotte's presence in his home, in his arms. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly at the directness of his proposal, but her response came without hesitation. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. I will. As they stood together watching the snow fall over the ranch, Wyatt felt a sense of rightness, of completion that he'd never experienced before. This woman, who had arrived on his doorstep as a stranger just days ago, had somehow become essential to his future happiness. We'll need to go to Miller's Creek tomorrow, Wyatt said, his arm tightening around her waist. To send a telegram to your uncle, explaining the change in plans. Charlotte nodded, turning in his embrace to face him. And to arrange for the minister if you're certain this is what you want. More certain than I've ever been of anything, Wyatt assured her, his hands coming up to frame her face. Are you? Completely, Charlotte replied, her eyes holding his. I came west looking for a new beginning. I believe I've found it, just not where I expected." Wyatt kissed her again, marveling at how natural it felt, as though they'd been together for years rather than days. When they separated, he rested his cheek against her hair, content to simply hold her as the snow continued to fall outside, transforming his ranch into a winter wonderland. "It will be spring before we know it," he murmured. "The snow will melt, the creek will run high with the thaw, and the hills will turn green again." "I look forward to seeing it," Charlotte said, her voice warm against his chest. "And summer after that, and fall and winter again. All the seasons, all the years to come." "Together," Wyatt said, the word a promise. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper, something that made Wyatt's heart swell with an emotion too powerful for words. "Together," she agreed softly. As the snow continued to fall over his ranch, Wyatt held Charlotte close, knowing that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them side by side. The cold Montana winter that had once seemed endless now felt like a beginning rather than an endurance test, the first chapter in a story they would write together. Charlotte smiled up at him, her eyes filled with promise. "We'll warm it together," she whispered, echoing his own thoughts as though she could read them. "Yes," Wyatt agreed, drawing her closer still. "We will." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow from the previous night glittering like diamonds in the early light. Wyatt woke with a sense of purpose and anticipation that had been absent from his life for too long. The knowledge that Charlotte had agreed to stay, to become his wife, filled him with a quiet joy that made even the most ordinary tasks seem meaningful. After breakfast, they prepared for the journey to Miller's Creek. Wyatt hitched his 2 draft horses to a sturdy sled while Charlotte packed provisions for the trip, warm blankets, food for the journey, and a change of clothes in case they needed to stay overnight in town. Working together, they moved with an easy coordination that belied the brevity of their acquaintance. "Ready?" Wyatt asked as he helped Charlotte onto the sled, tucking blankets around her to ward off the cold. "Ready," she confirmed, her eyes bright with excitement. "Though I must look a fright after days without proper toiletries." Wyatt's gaze moved over her face, the clear green eyes, the dusting of freckles across her nose that he'd come to find endearing, the soft curve of her lips that had matched so perfectly to his own. "You look beautiful," he said honestly. A blush colored Charlotte's cheeks, though whether from his compliment or the cold, Wyatt couldn't be sure. "You're biased," she replied, but her smile suggested she was pleased nonetheless. The journey to Miller's Creek took nearly 3 hours, the horses breaking trail through snow that had drifted deep in places. Wyatt and Charlotte sat close together on the sled, sharing warmth and conversation as the Montana landscape unfolded around them in a panorama of white hills and distant mountains. Miller's Creek was a small settlement, not quite a town but more than a trading post, consisting of a general store, a blacksmith's forge, a small hotel, a saloon, and a handful of other businesses that served the surrounding ranches and farms. A church stood at one end of the main street, its white-painted steeple rising above the other buildings like a beacon. As Wyatt guided the sled down the town's single street, they attracted curious glances from the few people braving the cold. News traveled fast in small communities, and Frank Miller had undoubtedly shared the news of Charlotte's presence at Wyatt Young's ranch. Their first stop was the telegraph office, housed in a corner of the general store. The proprietor, a thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, looked up with interest as they entered. "Wyatt Young," he greeted, his gaze moving curiously to Charlotte. "Frank said you might be coming in today. This must be the lady who got caught in the storm." "Charlotte Hayes," Wyatt confirmed, helping Charlotte remove her heavy coat in the warmth of the store. "Charlotte, this is Edward Simmons. He runs the store and the telegraph." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Hayes," Simmons said, his manner friendly. "Quite an adventure you've had, I hear." "Indeed, Mr. Simmons," Charlotte replied with a smile. "One with an unexpected but happy outcome. We've come to send a telegram to my uncle in Helena, informing him of a change in my plans." Simmons raised an eyebrow, his gaze moving between them. "A change in plans, you say?" "Miss Hayes has agreed to become my wife," Wyatt stated simply, his hand finding Charlotte's and clasping it gently. "We're hoping Reverend Parker might be available to perform the ceremony while we're in town." Simmons's face broke into a broad smile. "Well now, that's news indeed. Congratulations to you both." He reached for a telegraph form. "Let's get that message sent to Helena right away. The Reverend's at home today, I believe just 2 doors down." As Charlotte composed a message to her uncle, explaining her change in plans and assuring him of her happiness, Wyatt arranged for the damaged wagon wheel to be repaired by the town's blacksmith. By the time they'd completed these errands and called upon Reverend Parker to discuss the wedding arrangements, word of their engagement had spread throughout the small community. The Reverend, a kindly man in his 60s with a shock of white hair and keen blue eyes, welcomed them warmly into his modest home adjacent to the church. "Frank Miller mentioned you might be coming by," he said, ushering them into a small parlor where a fire crackled cheerfully. "Though he didn't mention the happy news. It's a recent development," Charlotte explained, her cheeks flushed with more than just the cold. "Very recent, in fact." "Love often works that way," Reverend Parker observed with a gentle smile, "striking like lightning when least expected. The question is not how quickly it comes, but how deeply it takes root." He studied them for a moment, his experienced eyes seeming to assess the connection between them. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, for he nodded decisively. "I'd be honored to perform the ceremony whenever you wish. Today, if that's your desire, or we could arrange for a more formal affair with time for preparations." Wyatt looked to Charlotte, leaving the decision in her hands. "What would you prefer?" Charlotte considered the question, her expression thoughtful. "I have no family here besides my uncle, who is in Helena. A large wedding seems unnecessary." She glanced up at Wyatt, a small smile playing at her lips. "But I would like a proper dress, if possible, something I can save to show our children someday." The mention of children sent a warm thrill through Wyatt, the thought of a family, something he'd long ago relegated to the realm of unlikely possibilities, suddenly vivid and real. Mrs. Simmons at the general store might have fabric suitable for a wedding dress, Reverend Parker suggested. "And Mrs. Miller is quite skilled with a needle. If you're not in a great hurry, perhaps a small ceremony in a few days' time. That would allow for some preparations while still honoring the promptness of your decision." Wyatt and Charlotte exchanged a glance, silent communication passing between them before Charlotte nodded. "That would be perfect, Reverend. Thank you." By the time they left the Reverend's home, arrangements had been made for a ceremony 3 days hence, time enough for Charlotte to have a simple wedding dress made, and for word to reach the surrounding ranches, ensuring that Wyatt's neighbors could attend if they wished. As they made their way back toward the general store to arrange for accommodations at the small hotel, they were hailed by Frank Miller, who emerged from the saloon with a broad smile. "Heard the news," he called, striding toward them through the snow. "About time you showed some sense, Wyatt Young." Wyatt accepted the older man's hearty handshake with a rueful smile. "Took finding the right woman. Always does," Frank agreed, turning to Charlotte with a courtly bow that belied his rough appearance. "Mrs. Miller sends her congratulations and says to tell you she'll be by the hotel this evening to discuss the wedding dress. She's beside herself with excitement, says it's been too long since we've had a wedding in these parts. That's very kind of her, Charlotte replied warmly. I'd appreciate her help enormously. The whole town's buzzing about it, Frank continued, falling into step beside them as they resumed their walk toward the general store. Not every day one of our confirmed bachelors decides to take the plunge, especially not with such a charming bride. By the time they checked into the hotel, a modest establishment with just 6 rooms above a small restaurant, news of their engagement had spread throughout Miller's Creek. Throughout the remainder of the day, a steady stream of visitors came to offer congratulations and assistance with wedding preparations. Charlotte was whisked away by a group of ranch wives led by Mrs. Miller to discuss the wedding dress, while Wyatt found himself the recipient of good-natured ribbing and sincere congratulations from the men of the community. That evening, as they dined in the hotel's small restaurant, Charlotte shared the plans that had been made for her wedding attire. Mrs. Miller had a length of ivory silk she's been saving for a special occasion, she explained, her eyes bright with excitement. She insists it's perfect for a winter wedding. They're going to start work on it tonight, and I'm to go for a fitting tomorrow morning. The women seem to have taken you under their wing, Wyatt observed, pleased to see Charlotte so readily accepted by the tight-knit community. They've been wonderfully kind, Charlotte agreed. I've learned more about my future neighbors in one afternoon than I could have in weeks on my own. Did you know that Mrs. Simmons came from Boston originally? She followed her husband west when he decided to try his luck in the gold fields. When that didn't pan out, they settled here and opened the store. I didn't, Wyatt admitted, realizing how little he knew about the people among whom he'd lived for 5 years. His self-imposed isolation had kept him at the periphery of the community, present but never fully engaged. And Mrs. Miller was telling me about the harvest festival they hold every autumn, Charlotte continued, her enthusiasm infectious. Apparently, it's quite the event. Everyone from miles around comes to town for dancing and a community dinner. It sounds lovely. I've never attended, Wyatt confessed. Always seemed to have too much work to do at the ranch. Charlotte reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. Perhaps this year will be different, she suggested gently. Perhaps it's time to become part of the community, not just live alongside it. Wyatt nodded, seeing the wisdom in her words. His solitary nature had served a purpose during the difficult years after the war, allowing him the space and silence he'd needed to heal. But perhaps that season of his life was ending, making way for something new, something shared. I'd like that, he said simply, turning his hand to clasp hers. With you. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity. While Charlotte was occupied with dress fittings and wedding preparations, Wyatt arranged for the repair of her wagon wheel and purchased additional supplies for the ranch, anticipating needs that had seemed unimportant when he'd lived alone, but now took on new significance with Charlotte's impending arrival as his wife. Extra blankets, a better cooking stove, materials to expand the cabin come spring. These practical considerations occupied his days, while thoughts of Charlotte and their future together filled his nights. The small hotel room, while modest, seemed luxurious compared to his cabin, and Wyatt found himself mentally cataloging improvements he wanted to make to their home. Their home. The phrase still caught him by surprise, stirring emotions he'd long kept dormant. After years of solitary existence, the prospect of sharing his life, his ranch, his very self with another person was both exhilarating and terrifying. On the morning of the wedding, Wyatt woke early, his mind already racing with the significance of the day ahead. According to tradition, He hadn't seen Charlotte since the previous evening, when she'd retired to a separate room provided by Mrs. Miller, who had insisted the bride and groom not see each other until the ceremony. After dressing in his best clothing, a dark wool suit reserved for rare trips to larger towns, Wyatt made his way to the church, where Reverend Parker waited to perform the ceremony. To his surprise, nearly everyone in Miller's Creek had turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity. Ranchers and their families from miles around had braved the winter roads to witness the union, a testament to the community's cohesiveness, despite the physical distances separating its members. Frank Miller, who had agreed to stand as Wyatt's witness, clapped him on the shoulder as they took their places at the front of the church. "Never thought I'd see the day," he murmured, his expression a mixture of amusement and genuine pleasure. "But I'm glad I have. She's a fine woman, Wyatt." "She is," Wyatt agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "Better than I deserve." "Nonsense," Frank retorted. "You're a good man. Just needed someone to remind you there's more to life than work and solitude." Before Wyatt could respond, the small organ at the back of the church began to play, and the assembled guests rose to their feet. Wyatt turned, his heart hammering in his chest, to see Charlotte standing in the doorway, a vision in ivory silk. The dress was simple but elegant, its clean lines emphasizing Charlotte's slender figure, while the rich fabric caught the light filtering through the church's stained glass windows. Her auburn hair was arranged in a loose knot at the nape of her neck, adorned with small white flowers that Mrs. Miller had somehow procured despite the winter season. But it was her expression that caught and held Wyatt's attention, the radiant joy in her eyes, the certainty in her smile as she began her walk down the short aisle toward him. Time seemed to slow as Charlotte approached, each step bringing her closer to a future neither of them had anticipated when she'd knocked on his door during that snowstorm just over a week ago. Yet despite the brevity of their acquaintance, Wyatt felt a bone-deep certainty that this was right, that Charlotte Hayes was meant to be his wife, his partner, his companion through all the seasons to come. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, Wyatt felt a sense of completion, of coming home in a way he'd never experienced before. The Reverend's words, the traditional vows they exchanged, the simple gold bands they placed on each other's fingers all seemed to exist in a bubble of perfect clarity, every detail etched into his memory with indelible precision. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Parker declared, his voice carrying clearly through the small church. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." As Wyatt bent to kiss his bride, the assembled guests erupted in cheers and applause, their enthusiasm washing over the newlyweds in a wave of communal joy. Charlotte's lips were soft beneath his, her hand warm in his own as they turned to face their neighbors no longer as individuals, but as a couple, a unit, a family in the making. The celebration that followed at the town's small social hall was lively despite the winter chill, with food contributed by nearly every household in the community and music provided by local talent. Wyatt, who had avoided such gatherings in the past, found himself unexpectedly enjoying the festivities, the heartfelt congratulations, the good-natured teasing, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. "Happy?" Charlotte asked as they shared their first dance as husband and wife, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as he guided her around the small dance floor. "More than I knew was possible," Wyatt admitted, his arm tightening around her waist. "And you? Any regrets about your hasty decision?" Charlotte's eyes met his, clear and certain. "Not one," she assured him. "Though I do need to warn you, I received a reply to my telegram this morning, Uncle Thomas wants to visit in the spring to meet my new husband and see for himself that I'm truly happy." "He's welcome anytime," Wyatt replied, meaning it. "Any family of yours is family of mine now." As the celebration continued around them, Wyatt found himself looking forward to the future with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Spring would bring not just the renewal of the land, but new beginnings for them, both expanding the cabin into a proper home, introducing Charlotte to the rhythms of ranch life, welcoming her uncle to their shared domain. By the time they departed the celebration, the winter sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Their wagon, now repaired and loaded with wedding gifts from the community, waited to carry them back to the ranch back home, where they would begin their life together in earnest. The journey was silent for the most part, both lost in thought as the horses plodded steadily through the snow. Charlotte sat close beside Wyatt on the wagon seat, her shoulder pressed against his, their shared warmth a buffer against the winter chill. As they crested the final rise, and the ranch came into view, the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn and outbuildings, the corrals now empty of cattle for the winter, Wyatt felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This place, built with his own hands over years of solitary labor, would now be a home in the truest sense of the word, filled with companionship and, God willing, children in the years to come. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," he said softly as he drew the wagon to a halt before the cabin. Charlotte's smile, luminous in the fading light, was answer enough. But as he lifted her down from the wagon, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with a passion that left no doubt about her feelings. "We're home," she whispered against his lips, her eyes bright with promise. Together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and the temperature dropped with the setting sun, Wyatt carried his bride across the threshold of their cabin, both of them laughing as he nearly tripped on the doorstep. Inside, the fire had been maintained by Frank Miller, who had ridden ahead of the wedding party to ensure the cabin would be warm for the newlyweds' return. Fresh candles had been lit, and someone probably Mrs. Miller had placed a small bouquet of dried flowers on the table, a touch of beauty and celebration in the rustic surroundings. "It's perfect," Charlotte declared, taking in the simple decorations with evident pleasure. "Absolutely perfect." Later, as they stood by the window watching snow begin to fall once again over the ranch, Wyatt's arms encircled Charlotte from behind, drawing her back against his chest. The soft weight of her in his embrace, the scent of her hair, the warmth of her hands covering his where they rested at her waist, these sensations grounded him in the present, while opening vistas of possibility for the future. "The cowboy watched the snow fall over his ranch," Charlotte murmured, her voice soft with contentment. "And his wife said, 'We'll warm it together,'" Wyatt completed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Every day through all the seasons to come." "I love you, Wyatt Young," Charlotte said, turning in his embrace to face him. "More than I thought possible in so short a time." "And I love you, Charlotte Young," he replied, the new name rolling naturally off his tongue. "More than I have words to express." As the snow continued to fall outside, transforming the landscape into a pristine expanse of white, Wyatt and Charlotte sealed their declarations with a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future, a future built on an unexpected meeting during a Montana blizzard that had brought them together against all odds. The months that followed saw the ranch transformed not just by the changing seasons as winter gave way to spring, but by Charlotte's presence. The cabin, once a place of mere functionality for Wyatt, became a true home under her care. Curtains appeared at the windows, colorful quilts softened the spare furnishings, and the scent of home-cooked meals replaced the simple bachelor fare Wyatt had subsisted on for years. With the spring thaw came the work of expanding the cabin, a project Wyatt tackled with renewed energy and purpose. 2 additional rooms were added, a proper bedroom to replace the small space they currently shared, and another that Charlotte insisted would be needed eventually, her smile holding secrets and promises that made Wyatt's heart race. As the snow retreated and the hills turned green with new growth, Charlotte proved herself not just a competent helpmate, but an enthusiastic partner in the ranch operations. She learned to ride astride rather than side saddle, insisted on helping with the spring roundup despite Wyatt's initial concerns, and revealed a natural affinity for the calves born that season. "You're full of surprises, Mrs. Young," Wyatt commented one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I never expected you to take to ranch life so readily." Charlotte smiled, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "I've always believed life is what we make of it. This place, this life, it's ours to shape together. Besides," she added with a mischievous glint in her eye, "there's a satisfaction in physical labor that teaching never provided, though I miss the children." "Perhaps we can remedy that particular lack," Wyatt suggested, his voice low as he raised her hand to his lips. "Perhaps we can," Charlotte agreed, a blush coloring her cheeks even after 3 months of marriage. As promised, Charlotte's uncle arrived from Helena with the late spring, bringing with him news of the wider world and gifts for the newlyweds. Thomas Hayes proved to be a jovial man in his 60s, with Charlotte's green eyes and quick intelligence. He stayed for a week, his initial skepticism about his niece's hasty marriage giving way to genuine approval, as he observed the evident happiness and deep connection between Charlotte and Wyatt. "You found something special here," he told Charlotte on the evening before his departure, the two of them sitting on the porch while Wyatt tended to evening chores in the barn. "Something rare and precious." "I know," Charlotte replied, her gaze following her husband's distant figure as he moved between the barn and corral. "It's not the life I imagined for myself, but it's the one I was meant for, I think." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your parents would be pleased to see you so happy, my dear. That's all they ever wanted for you." "And you?" Charlotte asked, turning to study her uncle's face in the fading light. "Are you disappointed I didn't come to Helena as planned? How could I be disappointed in your happiness?" Thomas replied, patting her hand affectionately. "Besides, Helena isn't going anywhere. You and Wyatt must visit when you can. The store is doing well, and I've recently taken on a partner, a younger man with fresh ideas. I can afford to take time away now and then, perhaps make the journey here more often." "We'd like that," Charlotte said sincerely. "And yes, we'll visit when we can, though it may be difficult to get away during the busy seasons." "Of course," Thomas agreed easily. "That's the nature of ranch life. But winter will come again, bringing quieter times." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "And speaking of winter, I brought something for you, or rather for both of you." From his pocket, Thomas withdrew a small velvet pouch. "These were your mother's," he explained, emptying the contents into Charlotte's palm. "She would want you to have them now." Charlotte gasped softly as she recognized her mother's wedding rings, a simple gold band, and a modest diamond engagement ring that had been in the family for generations. "Uncle Thomas, I can't—" "You can and you will," he interrupted gently. "I've held them for you since your parents passed, waiting for the right time. This is it." He closed her fingers around the rings. "They're yours now to keep or to pass on to your own children someday." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes as she clutched the precious heirlooms. "Thank you," she whispered, leaning forward to embrace her uncle. For everything. When Wyatt returned from his chores, Charlotte shared her uncle's gift, her voice trembling slightly with emotion as she explained the ring's significance. Wyatt listened quietly, his expression softening as he understood what this connection to her past meant to his wife. "We'll keep them safe," he promised, drawing Charlotte into his embrace as Thomas looked on with approval. For the future. The summer passed in a blur of activity: cattle to brand, hay to cut and store for winter feed, endless maintenance tasks around the ranch that Wyatt no longer faced alone. Charlotte proved herself an able partner in all these endeavors, her quick intelligence and willingness to learn making her invaluable in ways Wyatt had never anticipated when he'd proposed. But it was in the quiet moments between the work that their bond truly deepened. Evenings spent reading aloud to each other by lamplight, dawn walks along the creek that ran through the property, shared confidences beneath the star-strewn Montana sky. In these intimate exchanges, they learned each other's histories, hopes, and dreams, building a foundation of understanding that strengthened their already formidable connection. As autumn approached, bringing with it cooler temperatures and the first hints of gold in the aspen leaves, Charlotte confirmed what Wyatt had begun to suspect, that their family would be expanding before winter arrived. The news filled him with a mixture of elation and trepidation, keenly aware of the isolation of their ranch and the potential complications of a winter birth. "We should consider staying in town when your time comes near," he suggested one evening as they sat before the fire, Charlotte's mending forgotten in her lap as she rested a hand on her still flat stomach. "Miller's Creek has no proper doctor, but there's a midwife with a good reputation." "We have months yet to decide," Charlotte replied, though she nodded thoughtfully at the suggestion. "The baby isn't expected until January. Still, winter travel can be treacherous, as you well know," Wyatt reminded her, recalling the storm that had brought them together less than a year before. "I don't want to take chances with your safety or the baby's." Charlotte's expression softened at his concern. "We'll make plans, I promise. But for now, let's just enjoy this time. Everything is changing so quickly." Indeed, their life together was evolving at a pace that sometimes left Wyatt breathless. The cabin expansion had been completed just in time, with the second bedroom now being prepared for its tiny future occupant. Charlotte had begun knitting baby clothes in the evenings, her fingers deft with the needles as she crafted miniature garments that made the reality of their coming child all the more tangible. Word of the pregnancy spread quickly through the small community, bringing visits from neighboring ranch wives bearing gifts and advice for the expectant mother. Mrs. Miller, in particular, took Charlotte under her wing, sharing the wisdom gained from raising 6 children on the frontier. "You're well and truly part of the community now," Wyatt observed after one such visit, watching as Charlotte arranged a small hand-sewn quilt in what would become the baby's cradle. "A year ago, I barely knew my neighbors' names. Now they drop by regularly bearing gifts and staying for coffee." "Is that a complaint I hear, Mr. Young?" Charlotte teased, looking up from her task with a smile that still made his heart race. "An observation, Mrs. Young," Wyatt corrected, moving to help her rise from her kneeling position. "One I'm grateful for, as it happens. This place was just land and buildings before you came. Now it's a home, connected to the wider world in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Charlotte's expression softened as she read the emotion behind his words. "You've given me a place to belong, Wyatt, a purpose, a future. I'm the grateful one." As the days shortened, and the first snow dusted the mountains in the distance, preparations intensified for both the coming winter and the expected child. Wyatt worked from dawn to dusk, ensuring the ranch was ready, the barn roof fully repaired from the previous winter's damage, the corrals sturdy enough to withstand heavy snow, the woodpile stacked high enough to last through the coldest months. Charlotte, despite her advancing pregnancy, maintained the household with efficient grace while putting up preserves from their small garden and preparing the interior of the cabin for the months of confinement ahead. Together, they created a warm haven against the approaching cold, their shared labor a testament to the partnership that had flourished between them. In mid-November, with the first significant snowfall imminent according to Wyatt's weather-wise assessment, they made the journey to Miller's Creek. Following through on their earlier discussions, Wyatt had arranged for them to stay at the small hotel until after the baby's birth, unwilling to risk Charlotte being stranded at the ranch with limited access to help when her time came. Their arrival caused a stir of excitement in the small community, where Charlotte's condition was a matter of general interest and goodwill. The hotel's proprietor had prepared their room with special touches, extra pillows for Charlotte's comfort, a rocking chair by the window, a small crib that had been passed between families in the community for years. "You've thought of everything," Charlotte marveled as she surveyed these preparations. "Not me," the proprietor's wife assured her. "This was all arranged by the ladies of the community. We take care of our own in Miller's Creek, and you're one of us now." The weeks leading up to Christmas passed peacefully, with Wyatt dividing his time between the hotel in town and the ranch, where he rode out daily to check on the livestock and property. Charlotte, now in her final month of pregnancy, spent her days assisting with preparations for the community's Christmas celebration, her condition doing little to dampen her enthusiasm for the holiday. Christmas Eve found them at the small church, which had been decorated with evergreen boughs and candles for the occasion. As Wyatt sat beside his wife, listening to the familiar carols and watching the candlelight play across her features, he was struck by how dramatically his life had changed in the span of a year. Last Christmas, he had spent alone at the ranch, the holiday passing with little acknowledgement beyond a slightly more elaborate meal than usual. Now, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends and with his wife's hand clasped in his, the season's message of hope and new beginnings resonated deeply. "What are you thinking about?" Charlotte whispered as the congregation rose for another hymn. "How fortunate I am," Wyatt replied simply, squeezing her hand. "How different everything is from last year." Charlotte's smile in response was radiant, despite the fatigue evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. "Next year will be even more different," she murmured, her free hand moving to rest on her rounded abdomen. "Our first Christmas as a family of 3. The thought filled Wyatt with a profound mixture of joy and trepidation, the awesome responsibility of parenthood looming ever closer as Charlotte's time approached. Yet beneath the natural anxiety lay a bedrock of certainty that they would face this new chapter as they had faced everything since their paths crossed together, with mutual support and unwavering commitment. The new year arrived with a fierce cold snap that froze the creek solid and transformed the landscape into a crystalline wonderland. Charlotte, now past her expected delivery date, bore the waiting with characteristic patience, though Wyatt could see the toll the prolonged pregnancy was taking on her stamina. "The baby will come when it's ready, Mrs. Miller assured them both during one of her frequent visits to check on Charlotte. First babies often take their time. Wyatt, less philosophical about the delay, found himself growing increasingly anxious as January progressed. He divided his time between the hotel and the ranch, ensuring all was in order at home while remaining close enough to be at Charlotte's side when her time finally came. The snow that had been threatening for days began to fall in earnest on the evening of January 12th, coinciding with the first signs that Charlotte's labor had begun. By midnight, with the snowfall intensifying outside and Charlotte's contractions growing stronger and more frequent, Wyatt rode through the storm to fetch Mrs. Miller, whose experience with childbirth made her the closest thing to a midwife the small community possessed. The night that followed was the longest of Wyatt's life, a blur of waiting and worry punctuated by the sound of Charlotte's labored breathing and occasional cries from behind the closed bedroom door. Banned from the room by Mrs. Miller, who insisted men had no place in the birthing chamber, Wyatt paced the small hotel corridor until the proprietor took pity on him and brought a chair, along with a generous measure of whiskey to steady the nerves. Dawn was breaking, the snow still falling heavily outside when the cry of a newborn finally pierced the tense silence. Wyatt was on his feet instantly, moving toward the bedroom door which opened to reveal Mrs. Miller, her face tired but triumphant. "You have a daughter, Mr. Young," she announced, stepping aside to allow him entry. "A beautiful, healthy girl, and your wife is doing well though exhausted as you'd expect." Wyatt entered the room on unsteady legs to find Charlotte propped up against pillows, her face pale but radiant as she cradled a small bundle against her chest. She looked up as he approached, tears of joy glistening in her eyes. "Come meet your daughter," she invited softly, pulling back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with closed eyes and a dusting of dark hair. Wyatt sank onto the edge of the bed, overcome with emotion as he gazed at the miracle they had created together. "She's perfect," he whispered, reaching out to touch the baby's cheek with a tentative finger. "Just like her mother." Charlotte's smile widened at the compliment. "Would you like to hold her?" With trembling hands, Wyatt accepted the precious bundle, cradling his daughter with a reverence born of love and newfound responsibility. The baby stirred in his arms, her tiny face scrunching momentarily before relaxing back into sleep, secure in her father's embrace. "What shall we call her?" Charlotte asked, watching them with evident joy despite her exhaustion. Wyatt considered the question, studying his daughter's delicate features. "What about Elizabeth, after your mother?" Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes at the suggestion. "Elizabeth Grace," she agreed softly. "It's perfect." As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing Miller's Creek in a fresh layer of white, the Young family shared their first moments together, a new life beginning even as winter held the world in its grip, a promise of spring and renewal in the midst of the coldest season. The days that followed were a blur of adjustments and discoveries, as Wyatt and Charlotte learned the rhythms of caring for their newborn daughter. Elizabeth, or Eliza as they quickly began calling her, proved to be a good-natured baby, her occasional fussy periods easily soothed by her mother's voice or her father's gentle rocking. By the time the weather cleared enough for safe travel, Eliza was nearly 3 weeks old. The journey back to the ranch was undertaken with extreme caution, the baby bundled securely against the cold and Charlotte still recovering from the birth. Yet despite these challenges, there was a sense of rightness, of completion, as they crossed the threshold of their home with their daughter for the first time. "Welcome home, Eliza Grace Young," Wyatt murmured as he carried the sleeping infant into the cabin, now truly a family home. "This is where you belong, where we all belong together." The remainder of that winter passed in a haze of newfound parenthood, nights broken by Eliza's hungry cries, days filled with the simple joys of watching their daughter discover the world around her. Charlotte recovered her strength gradually, her natural resilience serving her well as she adapted to motherhood. Wyatt found himself changed by fatherhood in ways he hadn't anticipated. The fierce protectiveness he felt for this tiny being, the overwhelming tenderness that welled within him at her smallest smile or coo, The pride that swelled his chest when she grasped his finger with her tiny hand, these emotions transformed him, softening edges he hadn't realized remained from his earlier life. Spring came early that year, as though nature itself was celebrating the new life that had joined the ranch. The creek ran high with snowmelt, the hills turned emerald with fresh growth, and wildflowers carpeted the meadows in a riot of color. As promised, Wyatt took Charlotte and Eliza on walks to see these transformations, introducing their daughter to the natural beauty that surrounded her home. "She'll grow up knowing all this," Charlotte observed one afternoon as they stood on a hill overlooking the ranch, Eliza secured in a sling against her mother's chest. "The changing seasons, the animals, the land. What a gift to give a child." Wyatt nodded, his arm around Charlotte's shoulders as they surveyed their domain. "She'll know hard work too," he pointed out pragmatically. "Ranch life isn't always easy." "But it's authentic," Charlotte replied, turning to face him. "Real in a way that city life often isn't. She'll understand where food comes from, how to care for animals, what it means to be part of the natural world. Those are valuable lessons." Wyatt smiled, once again struck by his wife's insight. "When did you get so wise about ranch living, city girl?" Charlotte laughed, the sound carrying on the spring breeze. "I had a good teacher," she teased, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his cheek, "and a natural environment for learning." As Eliza grew from newborn to infant to toddler, the ranch prospered under Wyatt and Charlotte's joint stewardship. The cattle herd increased, the fenced acreage expanded, and modest improvements were made to the buildings and equipment as finances allowed. Charlotte's practical intelligence complemented Wyatt's experience, making them effective partners in the ranch's management, as in all other aspects of their life together. Charlotte's uncle visited each summer, delighting in his grandniece's development and bringing news and small luxuries from Helena. He watched with evident satisfaction as Eliza took her first steps on the porch of the ranch house, her chubby hands held securely in her father's calloused ones, her mother's encouraging voice urging her forward. "You've built something remarkable here," Thomas observed to Charlotte during one such visit, as they watched Wyatt teaching Eliza to feed a bottle lamb, his patience endless as the toddler giggled and squealed at the lamb's eager nudges. "Something that will last." "We have," Charlotte agreed, her hand resting lightly on her abdomen where, unbeknownst to Wyatt, another child had begun to grow. "And we're not finished yet." When the first snow of their third winter together began to fall, Wyatt stood at the window of their expanded cabin, watching the familiar transformation of his ranch into a winter wonderland. Behind him, Charlotte prepared dinner while Eliza, now nearly 2 years old, played contentedly with wooden blocks on the rug before the fire. Charlotte joined him at the window, her arms slipping around his waist as she leaned against him. "The cowboy watched the snow fall over his ranch," she murmured, echoing words spoken long ago. Wyatt smiled, drawing her closer. "And his wife said, 'We'll warm it together,'" he completed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And we have," Charlotte said softly, turning to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "Wyatt, there's something I need to tell you." The joy that lit her eyes told him what she was about to say even before the words left her lips. "Another baby?" he asked, his voice hushed with wonder. Charlotte nodded, her smile radiant in the soft light. "Due in early summer. Eliza will have a brother or sister to grow up with." Wyatt gathered her into his embrace, mindful of her condition though the pregnancy was still in its early stages. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "More today than yesterday, and not as much as tomorrow." Behind them, Eliza abandoned her blocks to toddle over, arms raised in the universal request to be included. Wyatt scooped her up, settling her between them in a family embrace that embodied everything he'd never known he wanted, until a snowstorm brought Charlotte Hayes to his door. As the snow continued to fall outside, Wyatt held his growing family close, grateful for the twist of fate that had transformed his solitary existence into a life rich with love, purpose, and the promise of more joy to come. The ranch, once merely a place of work and shelter, had become home in the truest sense of the word, warm with shared laughter, hopes, and dreams that extended far beyond the passing seasons. "We'll warm it together," Charlotte had promised on that winter day years ago. And they had not just the ranch, but each other's lives, hearts and souls, creating a warmth that would endure through all the winters yet to come.